welcome everyone to our panel session today. I am very excited for this, and I'd like to start by thanking the sponsors for this event, the Sadia, but also the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for bringing all of us together to have this invigorating conversation around what I think is one of the most exciting aspects of artificial intelligence. So our panel today is about generative AI. And just to set the stage for everyone, generative AI is essentially artificial intelligence algorithms like ChatGPT, but we will try not to use the word ChatGPT too much during this panel session. But essentially, generative AI models create new content, including audio, code, images, text, language, and videos. And today we're joined by an expert panel that I would like to introduce, but I want them to introduce themselves because the whole point of today is for us to hear from them rather than for me. So we'll start with Dr. Ebtessam Al-Mazroui. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. So I am Ebtessam Al-Mazroui, Director of Artificial Intelligence Cross Center Unit in Technology Innovation Institute in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rida Qadri. I'm a research scientist at Google, and I broadly work on AI technologies in the Global South.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Bhatia. I'm on the faculty of Stanford University, and I teach about business model innovation, technology, and its role in economic development. My area as an attorney, as a policymaker, and as an entrepreneur is the role in which technology can actually be used for social good.
Excellent, thank you so much. We will potentially be joined by our fourth panelist who's running a little bit late, Dr. Raed Al-Jadani. As you see, he's up there. He's a research scientist and advisor at the Saudi Data and AI Authority. Now, I would like to get the conversation started with a little bit of a general question to each of our esteemed panelists. And I'm going to ask to start with Karen, if that's all right. So my first question is, more generally, what either excites you or concerns you about generative AI models?
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you for moderating this. So excited to be here, especially this is such an incredible time for artificial intelligence and large data models. I'm very excited about its opportunities. One of the areas I'm most interested in is opportunities around healthcare. The large data that we have, large data sets that we've had, being able to think about personalized treatments, being able to think about all sorts of vaccines and other kinds of remedies that can be enhanced in terms of production timing, in terms of targeted development as well. We've seen that artificial intelligence, among other types of technologies, were used in COVID vaccine development too. So thinking about how do we make sure we're able to process large amounts of data and be able to think about ways in which we can enhance production and enhance personalized treatment in a large, in a significant way. So I'm very excited about those applications. On the flip side, I am concerned about some of its, ways in which we need to be prepared, and I think that globally we're not prepared. Part of it is thinking about data that's being used, and this is something that I know that we're going to be discussing in the panel, but making sure that it is representative of the global north and global south as well, east and west, and also thinking about making sure that there are ways in which we can explain all the decisions that are being made to the best of our ability. So that's one hand, just thinking about the ethics, the responsibility that's involved in data, as well as algorithms that are being generated, who's generating them, and making sure that we're not continuing the bias that human beings have and mitigating that effect with the technology. I am also concerned about a job displacement and making sure that we're prepared to handle a lot of policy matters associated with that as well.
Excellent. So I will come to Dr. Ebtessam for a moment, but I'm very pleased to say that we're joined by our fourth panelist, Dr. Raed Al-Jadani. Dr. Raed, if you'd like to give the audience a very brief introduction about yourself, and then I'll come back to the question that I was addressing to each of you. Yes.
My name is Raed Al-Jadani. I'm a computer scientist, mainly focused on computer vision. Now I'm leading the Computer Vision Research Center on Sadaya. My research is a combination of building a neural network for classification and for image generation. Yeah.
Excellent. Since we have you on already, Dr. Wright, a question that I addressed to each of the panelists to start the conversation is, and Karen just answered it. The question is, what excites or concerns you about generative AI models?
Yeah, it's a good question, that the question you ask, and I'm going to talk from scientific perspective how we can use generative model.
Yeah.
And before that, we need to understand there are two types of models in AI: generative model and discriminative model. Mainly, we use in a daily basis the discriminative model when we have a self-driving car, or if we would like to discriminate between two images, if we would like to differentiate between these two. So, but this model, the discriminative model, usually require a huge amount of data sets
Right.
that we don't have. So one way to generate this data set is by using generative model. I'm thinking about, for example, if we remember there was a car accident in Abu Dhabi by Tesla car where the car hit the camel. And the car hit the camel because it wasn't trained on camel before, right? So we have two options: whether we collect images of all the animals in the world with
Right.
different scenarios, or we can generate these animals in these different scenarios so we can train the model to deal with such scenario. So I think, yes, generative model is important to build stronger discriminative model, but of course there are another applications, the one we have seen like ChatGPT, where we generate text to image and so on. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. I just said at the start of this panel that we will try not to say the word ChatGPT too much
Really?
during this panel, but we
I'm trying
certainly
to.
can. It's very relevant. So Dr. Ebtessam, I'd like to come to you with this same question. I'm really glad that Karen brought up some important points, specifically around the ethics around deploying these models and some of the challenges, but I'd love to hear your perspective on whether you're excited or concerned about it, or if it's a mixture of the two.
Definitely excited. Why? Because today we are living in an era that we need artificial general intelligence, not to replace a human, but we need the humans to think in a critical thinking way. We need the innovation part, and this is what distinguishes us as a human. Nowadays, the daily labor, the daily routine, let the machine do it, and let's focus on something that the machine cannot do it. The generative language model or generative adversarial network, when it started long time ago. It is in 2016. It is not new, and we want that images to generate by itself and generate new things. Why? Because we want to lead to artificial general intelligence, and one of the main thing is let that machine be able to reason, generate, and think as us as a human. With this is possible. Yes, it is possible, and I think large language models such as I will say it again, ChatGPT or BARD. It is coming soon by Google, released this week. So there are a lot of dominant and the player in the market. That brings me to what is my concern exactly. You can see that now these generative large models are dominant by DeepMind, OpenAI, Google. And of course, OpenAI is funded $1 billion. The fund was for OpenAI. So there is a few players in the market. And it's very important that different countries, such as, for example, Middle East, they have to ramp up with these skills. You have to have your own on-premise large language model, on-premise generative language model, or generative vision model. Why? Because your data, the one you will use it using these generative model, you will pitch it somewhere. So you have to build your own generative large models, whether, for example, for the Middle East, and one of the great example by the limitation of ChatGPT. For example, Saudi Arabia, they don't have access, as far as I know, for ChatGPT. So there is certain countries that will not have this capability to use these generative models. You have to build your own generative models, and this will bring us to the ethical use. For example, the one you mentioned, because it is not only about the ethical use, by the way. It's about the privacy,
Yes.
the concern. When you use these generative models, you are submitting your data to it. You share your data, the data that, for example, companies like Amazon, for example, last month, they banned their employees to use ChatGPT. Because when you use the ChatGPT, you are prompting using your own codes, for example. We have license, we have patents, you have a new thoughts, we have government papers. So the concern is we are still late, and there is a few competitors only in the market.
Absolutely. So the issue goes beyond just surface level areas around ethics, but it's also about privacy and what kind of information we're feeding back into these systems as we use them. So Rida, I'd like to come to you from a researcher's perspective. What would you like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I think in terms of excitement, I'll kind of take a step back and say that some of the most exciting uses of technology almost always come from users and not from companies. Which is why I agree with what Dr. Abdeslam was saying, that we need as many players as possible in this area. And so what's very exciting to me about generative AI is that we're sort of creating a platform where users can build atop of. So for example, things like building their own coding environments or coding helpers or coding assistants atop of these systems. So I really like the openness that generative AI brings. I think in terms of concerns, one major concern for me is the possible feedback loop that we create when we kind of uncritically adopt the data sets that generative AI does develop. Right now, these models do pretty well because they are using millennia of human creativity and human originality, and that's what they're being trained on. But what happens when these models start getting trained on data that has been AI generated? And sort of from my perspective as a researcher, I still feel that a lot of the outputs of generative AI are actually not very creative. There is a lot of predictability, standardization, an amplification of almost sort of an aggregation. And so I'm sort of concerned what that means for the future of creativity and generation.
Excellent, excellent. I think it's great that we kind of end that open-ended question on that note, because what I want to dive into, and I'm very optimistic about the future of AI, especially how we deploy it and how we might use it. But I think it's important to dwell a little bit on the challenges around deploying these solutions. So I'm going to come to you, Dr. Raed, and ask you, with your extensive background in deploying and producing and developing these solutions, these models, what are some of the challenges that surround those areas? Or if you'd like to talk even more generally about deploying them and how we might go about doing them, please feel free.
Yeah, actually, I will divide the challenges into two parts. Usually, when we are dealing with an AI model, we have two phases. The first phase is building the model. We call it the training phase. And the second phase, which is the inference, where we are, as a user, using it immediately. So if we would like to upscale the model or deploy it for larger scale, we have to make sure the model will give us a good accuracy for this large number of users. And to make sure of that, we need to train the model in a large amount of data set, and we use huge amount of computing power. So the challenge usually around these two, I would say, bottlenecks. The computing power, since most of the new approach in AI use a neural network which heavily depend on GPU, and it's too expensive to get a large amount of GPU. So this is the first challenge, computing power that we can use it.
Right.
Second one, which is the data itself, actually. The data, which is, I will consider it's the main bottleneck, since you need to have a data that represent the whole distribution. If you have a data, for example, that if you would like to build a generative model to reconstruct, to the reconstruction of the street. If you train the data, or the data that you get is from London street, it will give you a good result in London. But if you try to apply it here in Saudi Arabia or in the States,
right,
you shouldn't expect it will give you a good result. So this is, you have this issue in AI, we call it how your model generalized well for the other data that have not been seen. So in order to build the model for large number of users, you need to make sure the accuracy is good. So the first challenge to get data that represent what you want to test on. Second challenge, which is we are going to face, which is give it to large number of users. And we have seen it in many applications. I will not mention some of these since we are not allowed to talk about. Okay, yeah, where you have a model that have huge number of parameters, to give it to large number of users you cannot actually, you have limited computing power.
Exactly.
So you have two approaches in this, whether you build the model that can do well with a good accuracy in small size, and there is a lot of research can be is done in that field, or you can increase your computing power, which is too expensive to get. So this is the second challenge that we have. And this is the
Excellent.
two main points that we face
Yeah.
as a researcher. Of course, we have some stuff related to algorithms, but something we can deal with that. yeah.
Absolutely. I think computing power and the number of users that you want to deploy those solutions with, scalability essentially,
Right.
is absolutely an area that we need to solve or resolve how we deal with it in the future, especially as the development of these models becomes more prolific. So
Okay.
Dr. Abtesam, you developed Noor, right? Which is a natural language model well before DALL-E, DALL-E, DALL-E and ChatGPT and these generative models became popularized, right? So can you tell us a little bit about the performance of these models and what steps we can do to work with scalability, with errors, with bias, and areas that we kind of need to fix and smoothen out as we deploy more of these models?
Okay, so first of all, I will explain well what is Noor. Noor is the largest language model for Arabic language. Maybe you experience other large language model used for English. You start to prompt in English and to provide you with the answer in English. But if you start, for example, prompting, I'm sorry to mention the name again, ChatGPT in Arabic, although it gives you the correct answer in English, it will provide you with misinformation, misleading information in Arabic. Why? Because we have limited data in Arabic. So before ChatGPT, which is built on GPT-3, last year we in Technology Innovation Institute, we said, okay, we need to build the largest language model in Arabic. So we common crawl all the Arabic data content and using different resources and high quality data. One of the main challenges that faces us is the high quality. What is the data filtration process that you will implement? In large language model, you have DALL-E, you have GPT-3, you have GPT-2, you have Gopher, you have Jurassic, you have Megatron, you have all of these. So you can go on and read how these are built. What is the architecture? Of course, they are built based on transformer, which is encoder and decoder. So we will use encoders only for Noor. We will use decoders only, but we decided to use the same transformer architecture that has been built for GPT-3, which is decoders only. So you have the challenges with coming with the data filtration. What is the tokens that you will use? Because how you token the Arabic language is totally different than how you will token the language model in English or multilingual large language model, or even not only limited to the language, by the way. So, for example, now the studies in DALL-E or Flamingo, they are using it for image. What is the token that I will use it for image? So these are not clear area because it's niche. So you have this limitation, but then even if you build this model, you have to make it more generative. So you have to avoid the toxicity level in these data. You have to avoid the bias on these data. As Dr. Raed, he mentioned that some of these models, they are biased. So I tried to prompt GPT-3, not ChatGPT before ChatGPT, GPT-3, just to prompt it, and then using also DALL-E, prompt for create an image for me, researcher in Abu Dhabi, and it generate the code. And using Midjourney, the researcher were beside the swimming pool using their laptop. Why? Because the data that has been used to train these models, it is biased based on certain region. So of course, how we can overcome these biases, how we can also overcome the offensive language, the toxicity level. And there are different metrics that you have to implement, such as Perspective API, for example, such as Safe Search, which has been implemented in Gopher, Palm, and so on. And we are currently also implementing it for Noor and other language model that we are trying to build.
Excellent. I'm very glad that you touched upon bias and inclusivity, because I want to circle to Rida for a moment and ask, from your background and your experience researching specific areas around ensuring that these models are culturally inclusive, are not prone to error, are unbiased, how can we measure and evaluate the performance of generative AI models in terms of both bias, inclusivity, or any other area of ethics that you deem relevant?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So when I think about evaluation, I'm thinking about two things. I'm thinking about what we're evaluating for and how we're evaluating that.
Yes.
So taking the example, for example, that Dr. Abtasam just gave of, if you are saying a researcher in Abu Dhabi and you get basically a white man on a laptop by the pool, you can build automated classifiers that measure skin tone, for example. So you can say, okay, like in 1,000 images when we prompt for something in Abu Dhabi, how many, what is the diversity of skin tone that you get?
Right.
Unfortunately, automated classifiers are also limited because they're limited by what a machine and computer vision technologies can recognize. Which is why we're also trying now to have more qualitative and human-centered evaluations that can evaluate for broader diversity metrics and broader bias metrics. So for example, one of the studies that we were doing, one of the stereotypes that people said that they kept encountering that they wanted to evaluate for was Muslim women as disempowered. Now that is a very sort of abstract concept, and creating an automated classifier for that is difficult, and which is why we need more sort of human eyes evaluating those images and those text corpus that gets produced. But at the same time, just even figuring out what to evaluate for is difficult because what metrics of bias matter to around the world are different, right? So for example, in the US, metrics of bias might be around race or skin tone. In the Muslim world, they might be around particular stereotypes that emerge that are associated with Muslim men or Muslim women or Muslim populations in general. And to have that foundational knowledge of the kinds of biases that we need to interrogate around the world to make these models globally responsible, you have to talk to these to diverse populations. You have to have diverse researchers who are even thinking about these things and attuned to these things. So one example that really stuck with me was in one of these research studies we were doing, one participant asked, when in the US, researchers made a really big deal that for some of these text-to-image models, every time you put in the prompt a lawyer, you get a lot of men and you don't get enough women. Would these same people be thinking about the cultural stereotypes that these models are producing for us in the South Asian context? And so that's a difficult question, and we can't get to that answer till we have more diverse voices in the room building these evaluations.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to have bodies around the world, like the Technology Innovation Institute, but also SADEA, investing in developing these models as well, right? It can't all be concentrated from certain parts of the world, and that's very important. Now I want to pivot the conversation a little bit from a bias perspective for a question that is always top of mind for me, which is that if any of you has actually used DALL-E, ChatGPT, or any of these models, you realize just how remarkable they are, right? And how they can replace a lot of tasks that we as human beings do. In fact, when I was generating the questions for this panel, I actually used ChatGPT for ideas, and it was absolutely fantastic. So what I want to touch upon, and I want Karen, I want your perspective on this, and that's why I left you for the last, because it's such an important perspective. From an educator's perspective and from your background, which is so varied, how do you foresee the deployment of these generative models might impact humans, might impact workers, right? From traditional as well as to creative sectors. And for the rest of the panelists, if you have something that you want to add to this, once Karen, as she's done, please feel free to chime in, because I think this is a really, really important, relevant topic that hits all of us a little bit, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So, it's funny you mentioned this, Tanya. I was laughing a little bit here because you mentioned that you used ChatGPT to come up with ideas around questions. Similarly, I did the same thing. I said, what would ChatGPT say about potential job displacement or about concerns about deploying generative AI? And I thought to myself, what can I add that's different and more than what GPT is actually doing. And I think there are three main functions that these large generative models do, and they're tasks. That's exactly what you said. The tasks are researching, aggregating research and information, synthesizing this information, and then writing it, creating some sort of content, some sort of format in which you can visualize it, you could read it, and so on. But it doesn't comprehend what it's doing. And secondly, it doesn't create something new. It doesn't invent. It doesn't create. It just synthesizes everything that exists previously. And so, of course, there are concerns around accuracy, but if we think about these as tools that we can use around the world to enhance our creativity, to maximize our potential, to think about the way the world operates differently, there are ways in which all of these functions, these three functions that these generative AI models do, that can actually save time and simultaneously help us solve some of the biggest challenges that we have that require more energy focused on those. So there will be job displacement, and we see that. And there are, I think, a few functions that we should think about as policymakers in government as well as businesses. And part of it is to think about prospectively, what are the jobs and the tasks that can be replaced and that will be replaced? And how do we think about ways in which those workers can get the skilling that they need, the reskilling and the upskilling that they need to actually maximize their potential to be some more of the creative problem solvers. So I think it's incumbent on all of us, especially upon government policymakers as well as within businesses, because this displacement is going to happen. And how are we going to make sure that we're actually prepared to think about the next phase, to think about not only employing people, but how do we maximize their ability and their potential to actually be partners in creating solutions for large problems that we have. There are also policies that we're going to need to put in place as governments and as the private sector as well to think about what are some safeguards we're going to need to have. If there are going to be vast numbers of people over the course of time that are going to be needing reskilling and upskilling, but there's also going to be some sort of a safety net that's needed as well. How do we make sure that everybody in our communities are taken care of, and what are different types of policies that we can employ as a result of that too? So when it comes to the creative sectors, there will be displacement among other traditional sectors as well. But as you had mentioned, it helped you generate ideas for questions. So you could take it beyond that.
Right.
So you could help save time and actually create more value. So part of it is thinking about how do we question what we're doing? How do we maximize creativity? How do we integrate new ways of thinking? How do we incorporate divergent viewpoints and dissent and help us use those as opportunities to envision the world differently and to use this as tools to create a better world for all of us as well. And so I think there's a lot of potential, but I don't think that anybody is prepared. As I was leading tech development for the New York City Economic Development Corporation, and we developed our responsible AI strategy, I spoke to a number of governments and I spoke to a number of folks within the private sector as well, and nobody is prepared for the job displacement that's taking place. And we have to be, I want to say prospective instead of reactive. We have to be prepared and take active steps in order to make sure that we're maximizing the use of these models and simultaneously making sure that we're preparing our people to innovate, but to do so in a way that's responsible.
Excellent. I don't usually go rogue with my questions, but you did spike curiosity in me, and I'd like to hear from any of the other panelists, if you feel comfortable sharing, how far along in the conversation do you think that the public sector is on a global scale when it comes to policies around job displacement and the future of work?
I think if you will allow me to start, no one was expecting generative AI model to be released on November by them. So it was like, and it like within 5 days you have 1 million users.
Yes.
And then it turns out the people, the public, I'm talking here about the humans as us, we love this tool because it makes our life efficient. You can use it for your daily job, so you will have the heavy lifting for you as a human, which we are born with. So I will use my skill, my critical thinking, my innovation to do something better than my daily routine thing. I'm speaking on a public one, not a researcher. Researcher, I don't have even time for my kids. So. What concern is the deployment of these generative AI models. It is very expensive.
Yes.
No one before wants to invest in these generative large language model or generative AI models. But now I believe most of the investors, they would like to invest in reinforcement learning, human feedback. Even big companies, Amazon, Google, they invest last week on with $400 million with a company doing reinforcement learning, human feedback, just to assist their recent model. So the investment is there, but even how you serve this model. And Dr. Wright, he already shared this information that even if you have this model, the ability and the access, it will not be for everyone in the world. So there will be a limitation based on geographic base. I'm not talking about here the access. Even, for example, the education, it will be affected. Some of the universities and the education system, they will allow using these models. Some of them, they will ban these models. So you can imagine the different criteria and the skills and the knowledge that our education system, it will not be no more traditional. Some of the countries, they will still use traditional model, not because they don't have access to it, but they cannot afford it. Because these large language models, they are heavily costly to serve them for. So that's why it is very important to build these small model just to serve for like specific tasks, whether for drug discovery, whether for healthcare, whether for educational system. And we have to also ask about ourselves, where is the governance and policy?
Right, exactly.
So until now, there is no governance and policy. You should act. All the countries, they should act because people, they will use it.
Yeah.
So there should be governance and policy, and you should allow this technology. It's similar to the calculator when it is banned at the beginning from school.
Yes.
Now all of us, we use calculator. Nothing happened to us.
Absolutely.
So we have to adapt with these generative AI models, but what we will change from our skill, what we can embed in our system to lift our humanity and living.
Excellent. Excellent. Anyone else, or shall we start wrapping it up? Yes. Okay, perfect. So we have about 6 minutes left, and so I'd like to again circle back to each of you. Rida, perhaps we'll start with you on this one, if that's all right. The question that I have is, what steps do you think we as a society, whether we're educators, researchers, or public sector representatives, what steps do we need to take to ensure the responsible development and deployment of generative models in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a super important question. Look, I think if generative AI has to live up to its future, we have to make sure that we democratize its benefits and not monopolize its benefits. And so I want to kind of talk about 3 things here that I think could help us. 2 that are sort of more technical and specific to the models, and 1 that's kind of a bigger picture question. So first, I think we have to think about how these models right now amplify majoritarian bias, right? Because they're trained on these massive data sets, which means that if there are like 1,000, whatever, let's say 1,000 images of or text tokens for one culture, and there's like 100 for the other, that 100 gets drowned out, right? So how can we start thinking about training these models on smaller data sets so we can have more niche representations? Second, I think explainability and transparency are very important. If users are to understand how these models are limited and make better judgments about what is being generated, we have to tell them, if a user puts in, tell me a story about a Muslim man, the model should, in very simple language, tell the user, look, this is why the model produced what was produced, right? This is what signals in the prompt mattered. Here's what the next token prediction was for associated with man, associated with Muslims. So I think those are, what data sets were sort of used in generating these generating these predictions. So I think all of that's super important. But I think there's a bigger picture. There's a bigger question here that's outside of the technology and outside of the AI development itself, which is what kind of social progress are we hoping for, right? And I think that's a bigger question that collaboratively all of us as a global community need to come together to address. What is it that we are building this generative AI for? Why are we building it? And what is, what do we see its appropriate role in society? And I think there's not like a simple answer to that, but we have to have a consultative process in answering that question.
Excellent. Dr. Riot, do you want to tackle it?
Yeah, actually, I understand the worry of generative model. As a human, we usually have the worry of any new technology that we are going to use. But let's not forget there is 3 reasons for having a technology. The first one, technology can help us to do something we cannot do as a human. For example, if I would like to lift something heavy, maybe I cannot lift it, so I need to use a machine. Or the second reason is to make my life easier. For example, if I would like to drink a cup of water, I can use the plastic cup to drink the water.
Yes.
But we shouldn't forget that in technology we'll have I would say disadvantage of using it. For example, the plastic will hurt our planet. So there is a third reason of technology is that technology will cause issues, will cause problems. So there is a third type of technology which is solve the problem that previous technology caused. Any technology will cause an issue. So we, as a human, we will invent a new technology that solve the problem of the technology that we have now. So, but again, generative model or any AI model, it will help us in many tasks or make our life easier, especially, I'm going to give an example here. Let's assume that we would like to build a classifier for cancer detection. We don't have all the samples for cancer. Can I use generative model to represent the location of the cancer everywhere, so I can build another approach or another neural network can find the cancer in a fast way and with high accuracy. So yeah, it can help us a lot, but of course there is an issue, but as a human we'll find a way to solve the issues that we are going to face with this technology. But in order to solve that one, we need to understand how this technology is built. We need to this technology only understands the language of math and probability. So as a human, we need to be strong in that field so we can direct this technology to go in which direction.
I love that, and it gives me a lot of hope to hear research scientists in positions like the one that you're in have a conversation like that about the human side of it. So Karen, I'd like to come to you, and then Dr. Ebtessam, you have the final word after that.
Okay.
Yeah, with the work that I led at the New York City Economic Development Corporation to build out a responsible AI strategy. It was something that we were able to execute, and I just wanted to kind of share the 4 prongs of what we were thinking about just on a very practical level. What do these things mean that we're talking about right now? What are ways in which we could practically be prepared? So aside from the job displacement and planning that we were talking about, developing policies and thinking about the education aspect, the other aspect is thinking about these kind of 4 other areas that are all interrelated. One is, how do we realistically come together as a community, as a society, and try to make determinations as to whether a specific generative AI model is actually being used for its purpose? And so what we thought about is, let's use specific use cases and think about it, let's say in the school context. If we're using generative AI and students are using it, we know that they're going to use it. So if we have an interdisciplinary perspective and we have technologists, we have lawmakers, we have school officials, we have students, we have parents, we have everybody sitting in a room to think about, when is this helpful to use? When is it not helpful to use? What kind of policies should we create? What kind of parameters should we create around this? Because it's inevitable. People are going to be using this. So as a community, under what circumstances do we see that it's beneficial, and under what circumstances do we see that students should not be using this? The second part is data access. What are ways in which we can ensure, and everybody's been talking about this here as well, is it smaller models that we're creating? How do we ensure that there are ways in which data from underrepresented countries and communities are actually reflective and not extractive? So privacy is an issue, security is an issue, but making sure that representation is a big issue as well. So are there data collaboratives? Are there other technologies that could potentially be used, or even legal templates to be able to share data more efficiently to promote innovation? Third is thinking about ways that we could support and invest in AI, generative AI for good. So whether it's in healthcare applications, whether it's in the creative sectors, whether it's in manufacturing, what are ways in which we're going to invest in that in order to extract as much benefit as possible from generative AI? And the fourth model is actually thinking about what are ways in which we're going to focus on education, not only for job displacement and upskilling and reskilling, but think about the people who are actually the data scientists and the data analysts and the engineers as well. How do they make sure that they understand the ethical responsibilities and the explainability aspect of it, the importance of data representation as well? That's a critical piece, but also educating the public, helping them be critical thinkers to not just accept this technology and generative AI as just the word, but instead being able to think critically about what is it telling me, does it make sense? And so investing in education all around to be critical thinkers, I think is going to be important too.
Absolutely, completely agree. So we touched upon explainable AI, and now I'd like to pivot to Dr. Ebtesam for the final word on that.
Okay, so we are running late, so I will make it very brief. I think Dr. Karen, she already covered most of the most important thing. So the takeaway, if you want to take something out from this panel, is generative AI. It's already here. The race is already ongoing. The most important for you, whether you are an investor, policy maker, working on the governments, on a private sector, researcher, where you will act, how you will use these generative AI models, where is the limitation, how you can embrace it for the human, because at the end we want to use it AI for good. So let's not forget AI for good, the ethical AI, the responsible AI, explainable AI, and this is very important. We didn't discuss the explainable AI, but what I mean is even if we invent generative AI model, we should try as a researcher, as scientist, to extrapolate the outcome of this one. So that times is up. I would like to thank everyone for your attending this session, and also I would like to thank my colleagues today for the information that they gave the audience and they share it with them, and also for you, Tanya.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.